Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. London in March of 2021 was a city suspended in an unnatural quiet. The United Kingdom was enduring its third national lockdown to combat the coronavirus pandemic. Streets that would normally be thrumming with the chaotic energy of 9 million intersecting lives were instead largely desolate. Citizens were legally mandated to stay at home, permitted to leave only for strictly defined essential reasons. It was a time of heightened anxiety, enforced isolation, and an overwhelming reliance on the authority figures tasked with maintaining public order and safety during an unprecedented global crisis. The police were granted sweeping, extraordinary emergency powers to enforce these health regulations. They could stop, question, and fine citizens who were found violating the lockdown orders. It was an environment that demanded absolute trust in law enforcement, because the law itself had reached into the daily movements of every single person. And it was precisely within this climate of isolation and expanded police power that a predator recognized a unique and horrifying opportunity. Today, we dissect the anatomy of police authority abuse. We will examine how the very mechanisms designed to protect a society were meticulously weaponized by a sworn guardian to orchestrate a crime that shattered a nation. Sarah Everard was a 33-year-old marketing executive living in the Brixton Hill area of South London. She was originally from York, a university graduate, and by all accounts, a vibrant, intelligent, and deeply loved woman. On the evening of Wednesday, March 3, 2021, Sarah visited a friend for dinner in the nearby Clapham area. Because of the lockdown, this gathering was technically a breach of the pandemic regulations. It is a vital detail, not to cast any blame on Sarah, but to understand the psychological vulnerability that would soon be exploited. The knowledge that she was technically violating the rules would have made her inherently deferential and anxious if confronted by an authority figure enforcing those very rules. At roughly 9 o'clock in the evening, Sarah left her friend's house on Lethwaite Road to walk back to her own flat. It was a journey of about 2.5 miles, a walk she had taken before, across Clapham Common and down the South Circular Road. She was dressed sensibly for the walk, wearing a green rain jacket, navy blue trousers, and a white beanie hat. She called her boyfriend Josh as she walked, chatting about their respective days. Their phone call ended at 9:28. That was the last time anyone who loved Sarah would ever speak to her. When Sarah failed to meet Josh the following day as planned, and when calls and messages went unanswered, a deep, pervasive dread settled over her family and friends. Sarah was entirely reliable. Disappearing without contact was completely out of character. On March 4th, she was officially reported missing to the Metropolitan Police. The initial response followed standard missing persons protocols, but the urgency quickly escalated. South London is heavily saturated with closed-circuit television cameras, both public and private. The investigation immediately hinged on a massive, painstaking effort to trace Sarah's final steps using this digital footprint. Investigators began physically walking her presumed route, knocking on doors and requesting doorbell camera footage and commercial security recordings. They managed to track her progress across Clapham Common and onto the A205, the South Circular Road. At 9:32, she was captured on the camera of a passing police patrol car. She was walking alone, unbothered, heading east toward Brixton. But after 9:32, Sarah Everard simply vanished from the dense web of London's surveillance network. She never arrived home. The digital trail went completely cold on a busy, well-lit arterial road. To understand the immense challenge facing the investigators, one must appreciate the sheer volume of data involved in a modern metropolitan manhunt. Detectives were not just looking for Sarah, they were looking for an absence of Sarah. They had to review thousands of hours of footage from hundreds of cameras, identifying every vehicle and pedestrian in the vicinity of her last known location. The breakthrough, when it came, was a testament to the granular nature of modern forensic video analysis. Investigators secured footage from the dash cameras of two separate London transit buses that happened to be driving down the South Circular at the crucial time. A bus traveling on the road captured a fragmented, seemingly innocuous scene at 9:34, just 2 minutes after the police patrol car had filmed Sarah walking. The bus camera recorded two vehicles pulled over on the pavement with their hazard lights flashing. One was a white Vauxhall Astra. Standing near the rear of the Astra were two figures. One was clearly Sarah Everard, identifiable by her green coat and white hat. The other was a man. What the bus camera captured was not a struggle. It was a remarkably calm scene. It looked exactly like an interaction between a citizen and an undercover police officer. The investigative team now had a vehicle, the white Vauxhall Astra. They utilized the United Kingdom's extensive automatic number plate recognition system, or ANPR, to track the vehicle's movements. This system consists of thousands of cameras across the country that read and record license plates, allowing authorities to map the precise route of a specific car. The ANPR data revealed that the Astra was a rental car. It had been hired from an enterprise location in Dover, Kent, a coastal town approximately 80 miles southeast of London. The investigators contacted the rental company to ascertain the identity of the person who had hired the vehicle. The name that came back sent a shockwave through the investigation room, a shockwave that would soon reverberate through the entire Metropolitan Police Service and the British public. The car had been rented by Wayne Couzens. At 48 years old, Couzens was not a career criminal. He was a serving police constable with the Metropolitan Police, specifically assigned to the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Command. He was a man trusted with a firearm, a man vetted by the state, a man who carried a warrant card that granted him the immense power of the law. The revelation that a serving officer was the prime suspect in the disappearance of a young woman completely shifted the paradigm of the investigation. The inquiry was suddenly not just about finding Sarah, it was about confronting the horrifying possibility that the perpetrator was one of their own. Detectives began a deep dive into Couzens' background and movements. The timeline they reconstructed was chilling in its premeditation. Days before Sarah vanished, Couzens had booked the rental car. He had also purchased a roll of self-adhesive carpet protector film, an item frequently used by forensic teams, but equally useful for concealing evidence in a vehicle. On the day of the abduction, Couzens finished a 12-hour shift guarding the United States Embassy. He was off-duty, wearing plain clothes. He picked up the rental car in Kent and drove into London, spending hours driving aimlessly around the southern boroughs. He was hunting. He was looking for a lone woman. The ANPR data and his mobile phone records showed him circling areas of South London before finally spotting Sarah Everard walking along the South Circular. The anatomy of the abduction itself is the most terrifying aspect of this case because it relied entirely on the psychological weight of authority. Couzens did not jump out of the bushes and grab Sarah. He executed a false arrest. He pulled the rental car onto the pavement, blocking her path. He approached her, showed her his police warrant card, and informed her that she was in breach of the COVID-19 lockdown regulations. He told her she was under arrest. In the UK, resisting arrest is a serious offense, and citizens are conditioned to comply with police instructions, especially during a time of national emergency. Sarah, knowing she had been at a friend's house in technical violation of the rules, would have felt she had no choice but to comply. The bus camera footage captured the moment she stood by the car, likely confused and frightened but cooperative. Couzens handcuffed her, placed her in the back of the rental car, and drove away. He weaponized the very laws designed to keep the public safe, turning them into a snare. He used the trust instilled in his badge to paralyze his victim, rendering physical force unnecessary at the point of abduction. Once Sarah was locked in the back of the Astra, Couzens drove out of London. The ANPR cameras tracked his journey southeast, out of the urban sprawl, and into the rural landscape of Kent. He drove to Dover, transferred Sarah into his own personal vehicle, and then drove to a remote wooded area near Ashford, a plot of land he had previously purchased. It was here, miles away from the city, miles away from the cameras, that the illusion of police authority ended, and the brutal reality of his intent was realized. The exact details of what occurred in those woods are known only to Wayne Couzens, but the outcome was devastating. He raped and murdered Sarah Everard. He then went to extraordinary lengths to destroy the evidence, burning her body in a refrigerator he kept on the land, and eventually moving her remains to a nearby pond. The methodical nature of his actions after the murder, much like his preparations beforehand, demonstrated a cold, calculating mindset, completely devoid of empathy or remorse. The manhunt for Couzens culminated on March 9th, 6 days after Sarah's disappearance. Detectives arrived at his home in Deal, Kent. The arrest of a fellow officer is a complex and highly sensitive operation. He was arrested initially on suspicion of kidnapping, and later, as the evidence mounted, on suspicion of murder. During his initial interviews, Couzens attempted to weave a fabricated story. He claimed he had run into financial trouble with an Eastern European gang, and that they had forced him to kidnap a woman and hand her over to them to clear his debt. This story was quickly dismantled by the sheer volume of digital and forensic evidence the police had accumulated. His phone data placed him at the site where Sarah's remains were ultimately discovered. The ash from the burn site contained fragments of her clothing. The carpet protector film he had bought was found in his car. The evidence was insurmountable. The false narrative collapsed, leaving only the grim reality of his actions. On March 10th, the investigation reached its tragic conclusion. Police searching the woodland in Ashford discovered human remains concealed in large builder's bags, deposited in a stream. Dental records confirmed the devastating truth. It was Sarah Everard. The discovery confirmed the worst fears of her family and ignited a firestorm of public grief and outrage. The fact that the prime suspect was a Metropolitan Police officer fundamentally altered the national conversation. It was no longer just a tragic story of a woman murdered by a stranger. It was a profound crisis of institutional trust. Women across the country shared their own experiences of feeling unsafe, of altering their behavior to avoid the threat of male violence, and, crucially, of fearing the very institution tasked with protecting them. The social contract had been violently ruptured. The warrant card, a symbol of safety and justice, had been exposed as a potential tool for predation. The public reaction manifested in a planned vigil on Clapham Common, near where Sarah was abducted. The vigil, organized by a group called Reclaim These Streets, was intended to be a peaceful gathering to mourn Sarah and protest violence against women. However, the Metropolitan Police, citing the ongoing COVID-19 regulations regarding mass gatherings, declared the vigil illegal. Despite the warnings, hundreds of women attended to lay flowers and stand in solidarity. As the evening progressed, the police response escalated. Officers moved into the crowd to disperse the attendees, leading to physical confrontations and the arrests of several women. Images of male police officers forcefully detaining female mourners at a vigil for a woman murdered by a male police officer were broadcast around the world. The optics were disastrous. The police response to the vigil further deepened the crisis of confidence, illustrating what many saw as a catastrophic lack of institutional empathy and a profound misunderstanding of the public mood. It highlighted a severe disconnect between the police force and the women they were sworn to serve. As the legal process advanced, the true depth of Couzens' depravity became clear. Faced with overwhelming evidence, he abandoned his fabricated story about the Eastern European gang. In June 2021, Wayne Couzens pleaded guilty to the kidnapping, rape, and murder of Sarah Everard. The guilty plea spared Sarah's family the agony of a protracted trial, but it also meant that the full details of the prosecution's case would be laid out in stark terms during the sentencing hearing. In late September 2021, Couzens appeared at the Old Bailey for a 2-day sentencing. The prosecution meticulously detailed how he had abused his position of power. They presented the evidence of his planning, his use of the COVID regulations, the false arrest, and the horrific aftermath. The court heard victim impact statements from Sarah's family, painting a picture of a beloved daughter and sister whose loss had left an unfillable void. Their words underscored the profound human cost of Couzens' calculated actions. The sentencing of Wayne Couzens was a historic legal moment. The presiding judge, Lord Justice Fulford, recognized the unique and horrifying nature of the crime. In the United Kingdom, a whole life order, meaning the prisoner will never be released and will die in prison, is reserved for the absolute worst offenses, typically cases involving multiple murders or acts of extreme terrorism. A single murder rarely attracts a whole life tariff. However, the judge determined that Couzens' abuse of his police authority to kidnap, rape, and murder a citizen fundamentally struck at the heart of the democratic system. The judge stated that the misuse of a police officer's role was of equal gravity to a political or ideological murder. By using his warrant card to facilitate the crime, Couzens had entirely subverted the purpose of policing. Consequently, Wayne Couzens was sentenced to a whole life order. It was a landmark ruling, explicitly recognizing that the betrayal of public trust by a law enforcement officer is an aggravating factor of the highest order. The conviction and sentencing of Wayne Couzens did not end the reverberations of the case. In the aftermath, investigations revealed severe institutional failures within the Metropolitan Police regarding their handling of Couzens before the murder. It emerged that Couzens had been linked to at least 2 prior incidents of indecent exposure, one in 2015 and another just days before he murdered Sarah Everard. In both instances, the investigations were botched, delayed, or inadequately pursued. The failure to identify and act upon these glaring red flags demonstrated a catastrophic breakdown in the vetting and disciplinary procedures of the police force. Had these earlier offenses been properly investigated, Couzens would likely have been dismissed from the force, stripped of his warrant card, and unable to execute the false arrest that led to Sarah's death. The realization that institutional incompetence had left a predator in uniform fueled demands for systemic reform. The pressure on the Metropolitan Police led to the commissioning of an independent review of the force's culture and standards, led by Baroness Louise Casey. The resulting Casey Review, published in 2023, was a devastating indictment of the organization. It found the Metropolitan Police to be institutionally racist, misogynistic, and homophobic. It detailed a culture of denial, where complaints against officers were routinely minimized or ignored, and where a defensive mentality prioritized the reputation of the force over the safety of the public. The review concluded that the force had failed to protect women and children, and that fundamental root and branch reform was necessary to restore any semblance of public confidence. The murder of Sarah Everard was not an isolated incident perpetrated by a single bad apple. It was the catastrophic symptom of a deeply diseased institutional culture that had allowed predatory behavior to go unchecked within its own ranks. The anatomy of this case is defined by the intersection of absolute vulnerability and absolute authority. Wayne Couzens did not succeed because he was a criminal mastermind. He succeeded because he possessed the state-sanctioned power to compel compliance. He exploited the psychological conditioning that requires citizens to submit to law enforcement, turning a basic social contract into a lethal trap. The meticulous planning, the use of the warrant card, the exploitation of pandemic anxieties, and the brutal finality of his violence all center on the deliberate weaponization of trust. The tragedy of Sarah Everard forces a continual, uncomfortable examination of the power granted to the police and the mechanisms necessary to ensure that power is never again used to facilitate such profound terror. The system designed to offer protection became the very instrument of her destruction. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.